So thank you once again for joining. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andy McGowan. I'm the Head of Engagement at the charity Caring Together. I'm also the Public Affairs and Policy Advisor for the charity Our Time. I'm really grateful that you can all come along this morning. I appreciate it. It's been quite a busy week for lots of us, and it's obviously been a sad week for both the country and for further afield. So I really appreciate you still coming along to the session this morning. Just in terms of some housekeeping, if you can ensure that your microphones are on mute, unless you're one of the speakers or if we're asking questions later on. It's great to see people already using the chat, introducing themselves. Please do introduce yourselves. It's a great opportunity to network, meet other people as well from this sector as well. I will be trying to keep an eye on the chat as we go through this morning's session. If there are any unanswered questions that we don't get to, I will be collating them and making sure we get answers and send them out with the slides and a recording afterwards as well. For those of you who have been to Young Carers Alliance event webinars before, we usually live tweet in terms of what we're doing, but during this national period of mourning, we're not doing any sort of social media at this moment in time. So instead, what we will be doing is we'll be next week, the 26th of September, we'll be doing almost a repeat of the coverage from that sense. So sharing some screenshots, sharing some quotes. So if you're not already following the Alliance, the Twitter handle is there for people to look at as well. And similarly, the resources that I share and talk about later on, we'll be publishing them on the 26th as well. So in terms of this morning's event, this is hopefully really just to help you understand more about what the change to the census is in relation to young carers, what some of the benefits are, but also what schools can be doing to prepare for the census. So I think for those of you who are working in the young carers world or have been working in it for a number of years, I think many of us didn't necessarily know, would we get to this day where we're doing a webinar about young carers being added to the school census. So it's a really welcome development, and I'm really excited the fact that we've got so many people here today wanting to learn more as well. Just in terms of the agenda, we have unfortunately had to have a change of speaker. So in terms of it was confirmed late on Monday that unfortunately civil servants from the Department for Education aren't able to take part in any events during this national period of mourning. But I've worked with the team there to put together some slides, which I'll speak to, and then I'll be sharing any questions that come that I can't answer with the department, and they've agreed that they're going to prioritise coming back to attendees on that as well. So without further ado, so what is changing with the school census in relation to young carers, and how might it benefit young carers? So for those of you who work in schools, apologies, I will be doing a bit of probably information that you already know to start with, but we've got a really varied audience in the room, which is really brilliant from that sense. So just in terms of a very brief overview as to what the school census return actually is. So as you can see, it's an electronic collection of pupil data. It covers primary schools, secondary schools, special schools. It doesn't apply to, for example, standalone sixth form colleges. It also doesn't apply in terms of the schools in the independent sector from that side as well. But what it does end up producing is around 8 million bits of data from this perspective throughout the year. It happens 3 times a year. There's different information that's collated at different times. The one we're particularly focusing on, which we'll be talking about, is the school census that's coming up in the spring. So the January one, which the dates will be shared in a second. We have had people really interested in this from outside of England. So it's worth just saying that the school census information that I'm talking about is in relation to the England school census. But a lot of the information in terms of best practice and what schools can do to prepare for this will be equally beneficial for schools, no matter where you are from that perspective, and similarly colleges as well. And as you can see, it's an obligation for schools to complete it. They have to provide the information. So in terms of the key dates for you to be aware of, so the census date for the spring collection opens on the 19th of January. And schools have got just under a month in which to complete from that perspective as well. The good thing about the census is it doesn't just give us sort of national data, it then is available to see what does it look like locally from that perspective. So the department are going to be coming back to me just to confirm when it's likely to be available in terms of locally, but they expect it's going to be around April time, so that your local authority will be able to see, actually, okay, how many young carers were identified in our schools, in our local authority from that perspective as well. And then there will also be the opportunity to look at the national data around the school census. And I've got a link later on in the slides, which gives you a link to where you can find out where that is hosted. If any of you are really interested in some of the detail around the school census from that perspective, or some of the information that I'm talking about today in relation to young carers, I have included 2 links here, both to the business and technical information. So that covers information about the coding, but then also the guidance around the school census as well. So that includes some of the information about the definition of a young carer and some of the other information I'm going to talk about in this morning's session. If I haven't said already, the slides will be shared, and they'll also go onto the Young Carers Alliance webpage, for which there'll be a link later on in the session as well. So, as I mentioned, it's really, really exciting, the fact that for the first time ever, young carers are being added to the school census. I'm really pleased. We've got colleagues from Carers Trust and Children's Society here, because they are 2 of the charities who, alongside many local young carer organisations and those involved in research, have long been calling. But it's a very simple change in reality from that perspective. But we're here. So it was included in the adult social care sort of reforms, the information there. And as I said, it's going to be coming into force from January 2023. I think one of the real positives around the sort of the approach that's been taken with the school census, and again, I know Carers Trust worked with the department on some of the definition for this, is actually it's quite broad. So as you can see here in the guidance, which goes out to schools, the definition is the one from the Children Act. So you can see it on the screen there. I won't read it out for people. But one of the good things about this is it isn't dependent on someone having had a young carers assessment, for example. It doesn't say how much care they need to have been providing. It doesn't say who they need to have been providing support for. So this really provides an opportunity for schools to get a really good picture about who their young carers are from that perspective. And again, as we go through this webinar this morning, what you'll see is there are different groups of young carers or prospective young carers who are really keen for schools to have on their radar to make sure that they don't miss this cohort of young carers. I think what's really helpful is the guidance also makes reference to the 2 forms of statutory guidance that are available. So keeping children safe in education, which has been recently updated, and also working together to safeguard children. And I think what's helpful about those documents, if you're not familiar with those, is both of them really clearly outline and explicitly say how all school staff should be particularly alert to the potential need for support for young carers. So I think when I speak to many young carers organisations who are part of the Young Carers Alliance, they often find sometimes it's difficult to get through the front door for some schools from that perspective. And so what we found at Caring Together is using this guidance as a bit of a hook can really help to try and say, actually, let us help you to make sure that you're actually delivering what you should be delivering in relation to young carers awareness. So from a technical perspective, I've included the codes here. So you can see there are 3 different codes that are here. So the default, what the department are expecting is that N, so not declared as a young carer, will be the default. So it will be up to school to actively change that when they have identified a young carer. So there are 2 different ones. There are ones here where the young carer has been identified by the parent or guardian, and then there's also one where the young carer has been identified within school. And so I had a conversation with the department about what happens if a young carers organisation does an assembly and then a young carer themselves thinks, oh, actually, I'm a young carer, because actually it wasn't school who identified them, it was the young person themselves from that perspective. But what they've said is because it's being done in school rather than by the parent, is actually that should be recorded as identified within school. So again, I think this coding will really start to help show actually how are young carers being identified. Is it within school? Or is it more self-identification in terms of parents coming forward for support as well? Inevitably, there will be somewhere they could fit into 2. If a school sends out information to their parent, actually that's a school instigated. but I think it's very much focusing on who has done that identification of that individual young carer. So I think it'll be really important both for young carers organisations to make sure they're aware of the coding from that perspective, and obviously for schools as well. So what are the benefits or the potential benefits of this change? As I mentioned, it's something that young carers organisations have been calling for a number of years. It's something that the Young Carers Alliance really welcomed when it was announced from that perspective. Because I think one of the key benefits is it will give a greater sense of the number of young carers who are in schools. And I think what will really help is it's very timely, because we'll have this data from the school census at a very similar time to when we're going to get the national census results as well. So I think in terms of data around numbers of young carers from that perspective, it will really help us to get a much more accurate perspective as well. It is really key to say that actually the school census, just like the national census, is only as good as the people completing it from that perspective. And so that's why the next point about raising awareness of young carers is so important. What we don't want is for this great opportunity to then have a whole load of schools where actually there's 0 young carers identified, 2 young carers identified, 5 young carers. We know there are many more out there from that perspective as well. And it is sad to say that there are still a small number, and a very small number, I will say, of schools where I hear saying, this is really interesting, it's really important, but we don't have any young carers in our school. And I'm sure there are many colleagues working for young carers organisations across the country who have that similar experience. So I think this is why the Young Carers Alliance has been so keen to make sure that we use this opportunity to really help schools to prepare for the census and raise awareness as well. But then what happens when we've got that data? Yes, we'll know how many young carers there are, but also it gives us the opportunity to be able to look at actually how do they perform? How is it impacting them compared to their peers? So they'll be able to look at attendance, they'll be able to look at exclusions and a whole variety of other data that they collect from the census and compare those where they're marked as a young carer with those where they're not marked as a young carer as well. So this can help both schools to make the case for improved support. So if they've identified a large number of young carers from that perspective, but also if they can see actually that attendance is being severely impacted within their cohort of young carers, that can really help as well. But it can also show actually what difference are interventions making. So if you're a young carers project who's doing a piece of work with a school, if you've done an in-school program, if you've done a targeted piece of work, what difference has it made over a substantial period of time in relation to attendance, in relation to attainment and exclusions and other key bits of information as well. And I remember, unfortunately, I can't find the information anymore, but I do remember Oxford a number of years ago did a piece of work where they actually did track their young carers and compare over a number of years how they did in terms of attendance compared to non-young carers as well from that perspective. And what I've done there is put a link in the slides to where actually the data is sort of housed. So when it's published, you can go to there and you can look at the data in a whole variety of different ways as well. If anyone wants to know more of the technical side of how that site works, again, I'm more than happy to link you in with the member from the department who said he's more than happy to answer any questions from that perspective as well. It's just worth saying I have seen sort of questions coming through in the chat. When we're on to other speakers, I will go back through some of those. And as I said, there'll be a number of those in relation to some of the technical and the process side, which I will collate and take back to the department and then send out the answers when I send out the slides as well. I just wanted to share saying actually, what difference can it make in terms of doing awareness raising with young carers? So at Caring Together, we've got a scheme called the Carer Friendly Tick Award. And what we did is we actually reached out to 10 of our schools who've most recently achieved the award. Most of them were primary schools, to actually ask them in terms of how many young carers they had when they first started. So we mapped that before they started their awareness raising sessions for staff, before they started assemblies from that perspective as well. And then we asked them at the end of the process, once they'd applied and been awarded, how many they knew. And you can see in terms of actually all 10 schools, and it is only 10 schools from that perspective, who in terms of who took part in this, but all of them increased the number of young carers who were identified to them. So as you can see, within mostly primary schools, the average number to start with was 7, and by the end of it was 22 from that perspective. And we'll be hearing later from Sam Viney at Glenmore and Winton Academy, and she'll be able to talk about some of their impact as well from that perspective. So it really can make a difference from that sense. Considerable number of young carers, and it's not just about numbers, it's not just about statistics. Obviously, these are young people who then we can support from that perspective, and I think that's a real key from that sense moving forward. So that was just a very brief overview in terms of around the school census and what the change is. As I said, I will go back in terms of through the questions that have come about some of the process. I've seen about what if it wasn't school or parents who identified. So I'll make sure to collate all of those questions and come back to you. And I said, apologies that I'm not in a position to answer some of the technical details, but I'm keen to make sure you get the right answer rather than Andy's answer from that perspective. So what we're going to move on to now is to look at actually what can schools do to prepare for this change. We deliberately decided to keep this webinar today. We did have a debate as to do we postpone it from that perspective, but we thought it's really important to give schools the time to think about actually where are we at the moment? What do we need to do in order to make sure we're ready for the school census so we have the most accurate record of our young carers. So we're going to have a few different speakers over the next sort of half an hour, 40 minutes or so. Covering about a whole different series of practical things that schools can do. So I think one of the key things is around making sure it's taking a whole school approach. I think in terms of sometimes there can be the tendency to think that the school census is something very technical, it's very data driven from that perspective, which is it is, but actually all school staff have got a role to play in helping to identify these young carers. All school staff have got a role in helping to raise awareness of young carers amongst pupils, amongst families, amongst their colleagues as well. So that awareness raising is going to be something that is key from that perspective. And it's also really important to consider some of the groups of young carers that are often missed. So we're going to be looking at just a few of the different groups today. We won't capture all of them in the space we've got, unfortunately. The window was obviously sort of quite tight in terms of the agenda. But for example, I know I've seen in the chat saying Kath Pickles on the call from Restitute, who support young people where there's been sort of sexual abuse and other traumatic situations. So again, there are often young carers in terms of the impact that has on mental health for the family member who's been a victim there. There are a number of other people in the chat who will no doubt introduce themselves, share their details as well. But it's really important to make sure we're not just looking at young carers of parents with a physical disability or young carers where they're caring for an adult. There are other groups who will just be missed. And it's really vital we have a really broad sense of who all of the young carers are. And I think one of the key things that I'm going to try and stress throughout this webinar today is actually that obviously having support for young carers is vital, but actually, particularly in relation to the school census, having systems in place, having processes in place to identify those young carers, not just now, not just for this school census, but actually what about for all of the future young carers who are coming into your school? If they're transitioning up from year 6 to year 7, how do we make sure that information doesn't get lost? How do we make sure the secondary school gets that information? And then what you as a school do with that information. And again, we'll hear later on from Sam about some of the work that they've been doing to really make sure that their young carers are both attaining and flourishing within school from that perspective as well. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to hand over now to Laura Bennett, who's the Head of Policy and External Affairs at Carers Trust, who's just going to talk to you first about the Young Carers in Schools programme, which really helps to give that whole school approach to identification and support of young carers. So I'll hand over to Laura.
Thanks so much, Andy. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Bennett. I'm Head of Policy and External Affairs at Carers Trust. Andy, I've forgotten to ask, can I advance my own slides or do I have to say, next slide, please, in the manner of Chris Whitty?
Unfortunately, it's the next slide, please, Job, I'm afraid.
No, not at all. Thanks so much, Andy. Sorry to be a nuisance. In which case, next slide, please. So just to just to let you know who Carers Trust are, in case you haven't come across us before. So we're a national charity UK-wide who supports unpaid carers, and primarily we work with what we call our network partners, who are our brilliant network of local carer services, many of whom are on the call today, and some of you who are also here from more practice-based services, so like school support, may be working with those network partners directly. Carers Trust works to improve support services of recognition for anyone who's living with the challenges of caring, unpaid, for a family member or friend, and who we say that that's somebody who's ill, older, disabled, or who has mental health or addiction problems. With our network, we're the biggest provider of carer services in the UK, and we've supported over 850,000 unpaid carers last year, including over 54,000 young carers and young adult carers. And we also support carers by providing home care services, that's CQC regulated care services in England and Wales. And Carers Trust have been supporting young carers for a number of years, really using the research and evidence base that's been made by lots of people, including Professor Saul Becker, who's our ambassador and who's also on the call today, really making that case for change for young carers. We're absolutely delighted that the government have finally accepted our calls for improved data around young carers' attendance and attainment in school. It's something we've been calling for a really long time. Next slide, please, Andy. Thank you. I'll be talking today with Luella Gould, from our colleague from the Children's Society, and with the Children's Society we run the Young Carers in Schools programme. This is a really important programme, and it's a way that you can get national recognition for raising outcomes for young carers through the Young Carers in Schools Award, which Luella will talk about in a moment, that the Children's Society lead on. And that is an England-only award, although there are awards in England. There are other ways that you can recognise that in Wales and Scotland. And there are local awards as well, so it may be that you take part in a different award locally than the Young Carers in Schools Award. The Young Carers in Schools programme it's evidence-backed, it's really easy to use, and it's got some really helpful, manageable steps to improve educational outcomes for this group of pupils. And how the programme works is that it really breaks down those steps so that your school can decide what you should do next. I've included the link in the programme, and there's also the step-by-step guide that's linked in there. Adam Rogero Chakir, who's our Young Carers Project Officer, is also on the call, and he's been working on updating those resources as well, which will be available soon. And if you sign up to the Young Carers in Schools programme through the Young Carers in Schools website, which is the first link on the slide, so youngcarersinschools.com, you can also access other things. So we've got lots of kind of like template policies, lots of good practice examples, those kinds of things as well. And that's a picture of the step-by-step guide there just now. Oh, sorry, I'm just seeing someone saying that we're not got a slides. Is that working for everybody? If you could, maybe if you go to reactions and do thumbs up, you can see the slides. Okay, great, thanks so much. Next slide, please, Andy. Thank you. So thanks so much, everyone. So the reason why we think the Young Carers in Schools and the school census data is really important is that once schools have identified young carers and young adult carers, so thinking about those who are young carers who are post 16 as well, we really hope that they can use that data from the school census to make that offer of support from the school to young carers. And I think what's really important for schools to understand is that what's great is that if they can make the offer of their support from the school side. So that can absolutely be a partnership offer of support to that young carer and their family, working in partnership, for example, with the local NHS, so that young carers get any health support that they might need. That could be with their physical health, it could also be with their mental health as well. And also they might be being included in decisions where that's appropriate for the person they care for. The local council, so the local council have got really important duties in making sure that young carers receive a statutory assessment of their needs, and that their family receive an assessment of their needs, and that support is put in place too. And something that's really helpful to know is that that can be put in place so that young carers don't have to do what's called excessive or inappropriate caring, which is what the Act defines that as being. So it's not that, so young carers, for example, might be doing some caring, but that shouldn't be impacting on their well-being or their education and attainment. And also one of the ways in which young carer or their family can get support. So that could be a disabled sibling, for example, or that could be a parent with a mental health issue or a parent with a physical disability, is on the basis of their parenting responsibility for a child. And also in partnership with a local carer service to make sure that there's that kind of like wraparound holistic support. Lots of schools do have a young carers worker who's already going into school, so that can be a really good place to start. And many young carer services are already providing that kind of in-reach into schools work, direct work in schools, support to help with things like homework clubs, for example, and also providing things like breaks so that young carers can spend a bit of time with their peers and people that they might have something in common with. Lots of them run really good activities programs, for example, and they can also help them access what they need to in terms of support. So if everyone's working together in partnership, so you've got that real partnership offer of support, then schools just need to do what's needed in education. And sometimes that's really simple things. Sometimes it's asking some sensible questions like, tell me a bit more about why you're late today. Tell me a bit more about why you were angry in class today. So sometimes it's just asking some really sensible questions and having something in place so that young carers can be seen and supported. So understanding that behaviour can be linked to what might be going on at home. So not always seeing lateness as something that needs to be punished, for example, but something that might need to be understood. Flexible homework deadlines, things like that, or providing support to do homework in schools, for example. So sometimes it's quite simple things that can be done alongside other things that might be happening in school. And the Young Carers in Schools programme will help schools to do the education part of that partnership support. Next slide, please, Andy. Thank you. So as I mentioned, in terms of what's available from a council in terms of support for young carers and their families, young carers and their families are entitled by law to an assessment of their needs and to support if the assessment shows that's needed. That might be to prevent young carers from doing any caring responsibilities at all, or often it's to avoid young carers taking on what's called excessive or inappropriate caring responsibilities. When we talk about support, that will obviously depend on what the young carer and their family need, but that could include having a break, for example, from caring. That could be some time away from caring for a short time, so perhaps through going to a local young carer service, for example. And often young carers themselves do say that school is a kind of a break, in that it can be, when things work well, can be a time away from caring, a time to just be a young person, to focus on their education, to focus on what they need, to take part in activities at school, for example. And it can also be some time away. So that could be having a replacement care worker so that young carers don't have to do so much caring, or it could be having an actual holiday. So that could be time with their family, where there are care workers there, or that could be a separate time so young carers aren't with their family. And also it could be things like, so where schools can put in place extra support as well. So that could be, as I mentioned, things like flexible homework deadlines, or support to take part in activities. That could be through things like having extra bursary help available, so there's young carers can be thought of as a group who might need that extra support. And we really hope in time that crucial attainment and attendance data that we're going to have about young carers will really be able to show us how their future life chances, including their education and employment, can be impacted. Slide, please, Andy. Oh, sorry, that's the end. Luella's going to talk to us now about the actual Young Carers Award. So I'll hand over to her, but I'm available to take questions later.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everyone. My name is Luella Gould, and I'm the service manager for the Include Young Carers service at the Children's Society. And as Laura said, we work in partnership with the Carers Trust to run the Young Carers in Schools programme. And Laura has given a brilliant overview of the programme itself. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about what the award is and focusing very, very quickly on the Bronze Award. And I know there's some schools here, I recognise a few names and faces today of people who have engaged in this Young Carers in School Award already. So please, if there's any questions, put them in the chat. And feel free, if you're from a school or a project that has already engaged in this, feel free to equally answer questions as I can too. Next slide, please. This will keep you on your toes, Andy, with these slides moving very quickly. So approximately 8 years ago, as we do throughout all of our work, we consulted with young carers, and as we still hear today, young carers are consistently telling us that they struggle with schools understanding them and supporting them with the needs that they have as young carers. And because of this, we really felt that there was a need for a programme to support young carers in schools and also celebrate the schools that are supporting and identifying those young carers within their schools. So from what young carers told us, we kind of broke that down into 5 clear areas, which turned into 5 clear standards. Next slide, please, Andy. And there is a bronze. Oh, my understand's gone really weird on this screen. There's a bronze, silver and gold, and as I said, we'll just be very, very briefly going through the Bronze Awards and what that looks like. So the 5 pillars, the 5 standards can be broken down into understand, inform, identify, listen and support. Next slide, please, Andy. So around understand, this is all around understanding within the school environment, so that it makes sure that the pupils and the staff, as well as parents, have an understanding of what a young carer is. So this could be appointing a young carers lead. And I know that on the call today, I saw some people saying they're a young carer champion, young carer lead within their school, which is brilliant. So having someone on SLT who is a young carers lead representative, but also an operational lead. So we find from schools that apply for the award, this could be a pastoral lead, pastoral worker, a learning mentor or teaching assistant, for example. And they have the responsibility for understanding and addressing those young carers' needs. But also within this standard, it's around letting the pupils and the families and the staff know about the support which is in the school and who to contact. So kind of good practice for that, we say, if you have a notice board within school, have a designated one for young carers. Some schools decide to put it under their wellbeing notice board and have a clear photo and job title on the notice board, so that pupils within the school can clearly see who they can go to. Next slide, please. And here's just an example of some good evidence that we've had sent in for the awards that you can see there. Next slide, please. Told you it's fast. The second standard is inform. So this is making sure that everybody within the school is informed, especially within this one, parents and staff. So having an informative webpage or newsletter, for example, which has a specific section around young carers, which shows that whole school commitment and whole school working that Andy was talking about at the start. Making sure that in the staff room there is a designated space for young carers awareness, that's either within the whole school notice board in the staff room or a designated young carers one, and that's endorsed by an SLT member with their contact details, so staff are aware who to go to should they have any questions. And then also raising it up a level in management, making sure that governors are aware of young carers, not just the award if you're applying, but actually young carers issues, and that the whole school support for young carers is being discussed at a governors meeting. So evidence for that, for example, could be a copy of the agenda. Things could be taken out of confidential, a copy of agenda or minutes or letter to the governors. Next slide, please. We can go quickly. There's 2 slides of evidence. So these just show a web page, and then the next one shows copies of governors' letters and governors' agenda. Thanks, Andy. And then the third standard is all around identification. So making sure that there are processes and systems in place so that young carers can be identified. And this one's really important in terms of the school census as well and what's coming up. Making sure that there are informative and comprehensive range of posters within the school, especially on the staff notice board, around those impacts and identification and who they can be signposted to. But alongside that, making sure that those folders are also within the school shared drive so that staff can access them from their classrooms as well, and is easily accessible. And as you work up the standards, so work up the awards from bronze to silver to gold, you will see that in silver, for example, then training will need to take place within your school. We don't ask that for bronze level, but especially within silver, then working to gold, then we expect that information to be taken into staff training. Next slide, please. So here's some examples of staff notice boards, and Laura was talking about all the resources that we have on our website and that are currently being updated. All of that can be printed off as well. So a lot of schools just use the resources that are there to hand. It's really easy to just print off and pop up, and there's posters ready to go. So it stops the kind of workload for the schools, which, you know, you're very much under pressure. Next slide, please. And there's just a copy of the shared drive, more evidence to show you good practice. And the fourth standard is all around listening, so making sure that there is a designated member of staff, but that member of staff is known to pupils and that there is a space for them to talk to that member of staff. So we recommend a drop-in session for young carers or a specific young carers group within the school that is well advertised. So we'd like to see that on the school notice board, for example, or often in secondary schools, they might have an email system. So we recommend a communication system that is appropriate to the age of the pupils within your school. So secondary schools might have an email that's young carers at their school or the teacher at their school. But in primary schools, we might see a communication system that's a little bit of a box, or often schools might use a worry monster to kind of put within the worry monster's mouth. I think we've got an example on the next slide. Yeah, so this school said about tell a little birdie, and it was a bird box, which was quite a nice way of doing it, but different schools have different approaches, but just some way of communication. And there you can clearly see on the notice board the young carer drop-in times that pupils can clearly see. And finally, the final standard is all around support. So making sure that there is that holistic support. So again, Laura talked about that kind of step up of level for homework, for example. So in schools, we're finding not so much in primary schools aren't offering that homework support, but that's absolutely fine. But secondary schools might be offering a kind of academic homework club, for example, that young people can attend during school time. But we're looking for, under this standard of support, a holistic way that schools can support them, and also looked at other agencies. So a lot of schools will work with their local young carers service, or if you're a young carer service, we know that you might be going into schools, and this is just showing that you are advertising the local young carer service and groups, as well as other details of wellbeing support and school nurse, for example, and external agencies online, Couth, for example, or Childline. And there's just a lovely notice board, another example. So a few years ago, we had the YSIS Award evaluated by an external evaluator. And these are just some of the statistics that found that schools that engaged with the Young Carers in Schools Award and had gained it had found that overall there was better understanding and support for young carers within their schools. And as you can see, head teacher comments that it enabled them to ensure that the right support was in place for young carers and they were more aware and able to address their needs and issues. And again, just some stats to end with around engagement, improvements in the classroom, and achievements and overall happiness. And finally, if you have any questions or you're really interested in taking part in the awards, then please do contact us at the Young Carers in Schools designated email address, and we will get back to you. And also the website youngcarersinschools.com, which are in Laura's slides, and I think you're getting these slides at the end, so you'll be able to put it in, click directly, and I can put it in the chat as well. But yeah, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. And yeah, thank you so much for listening.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Laura and Noelle. It's really, really helpful just to see the variety of ways in which schools can do that sort of whole school approach. So I think obviously you've got the Young Carers in Schools programme, and some of you may know that some of your local young carers organisations may have a local scheme as well from that perspective. And it's just really trying to get that whole school approach throughout. Just to answer the question in the chat, yes, the slides will be available, as will the recording. So if any of you have joined late or dipped in and out, the recording will be available as well from that perspective. So now, in terms of how do we raise that awareness, how do you identify the young carers? One of the sort of mechanisms that has been identified is using a tool called the Multidimensional Assessment of Caring Activity, so the MACA. And I'm delighted that we've got Professor Saul Becker here, who's involved and led the research team who's developed this tool. to really talk about actually how this tool can be used to try and raise awareness and help you to identify your young carers within your school as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Saul.
Thanks very much. I just want to check firstly that you can hear me okay?
Yes, Saul.
Thank you very much indeed. So let me, I've got about 10 minutes just to explain what the Maca is. And it could be, of course, that many of you are already using the Maca. The Maca is a psychometric instrument. It comprises of 18 questions in which you are asking young carers to identify whether they do any of the 18 tasks that have been identified, whether they do them some of the time, a lot of the time, or they never do them. And if they never do them, then they're not a young carer. If they do them some of the time or a lot of the time, then they are likely to be a young carer, and they might be what I call a heavy-end young carer who are doing a lot of caring. And I'll talk about how you score these things in a moment. The Maca is used then to identify young carers, and it can be used in any setting. It can be used in schools, it could be used in youth clubs, it could be used on the corner of the street, it could be used anywhere to identify whether a child lets you know through ticking the boxes whether they're a young carer or not. The 18 statements, the 18 items in the Maca are derived, they're not just randomly selected, they are derived from hundreds of statements that young carers told us they did, caring jobs that they did in the home. So we had over 500 or 600 young carers were involved in coming up with the original list of statements and items. And then through the magical powers of statistics, we were able to break down those hundreds of statements into 18 items that captured everything else. So that if you were saying, if you were a young carer and you say, I wash up dishes or put dishes in a dishwasher, or I take responsibility for shopping for food, ticking that you do some of those things some of the time or a lot of the time would also capture many of the other statements that might have been related to those kind of things. So each of those statements is not just a statement about that thing. It captures a whole range of other kinds of caring roles or responsibilities or tasks that you would do in the home. So effectively, when a child completes the Maca, then you are able to identify whether they're not a young carer because they've ticked most of the things never, or that they are a young carer, and depending on how you score these things, you'll be able to tell whether they're a heavy-end young carer. The Maca is used in hundreds of young carers projects around the world. It's used in 15 countries. It's been validated in a number of countries. It's just recently been used in 6 European countries where the data has been compared across those countries to see the different characteristics of young carers. The BBC in 2010 and 2018 used the Maca to identify young carers in schools because the census identification of young carers usually produces a proportion of children who are carers, which is about 2.3% of all children are identified as young carers by their parents or head of household. But when you ask children directly if they're a young carer by using the Maca, you find that that proportion is around 10% of all children are young carers and of the heavier end of young caring. So the Maca is a way of telling us what children say about their caregiving roles, as opposed to what parents or heads of households would say. A couple of months ago, the Children's Commissioner for England, in her report on absenteeism from schools, recommended that all schools should use the Maca to identify young carers in schools that may be having problems. You could use the Maca to identify young carers and to identify young carers in schools if you're working with a particular school. And that school might not be aware of young carers. So I know from talking to Graham from Cheshire Young Carers Project and other Young Carers Project directors that many schools don't know who their young carers are. So from the point of view of the school census, they may be ticking the N box and not registered or not recorded because they don't know who their young carers are. Whereas you might know that in a particular school, there are young carers because you use the MACA or whatever, or you've been engaged. And so you would be able to tell the schools who young carers are in their schools. And also, of course, if the schools themselves were to use the MACA in classrooms to do a survey of their own pupils, they would then pick up a lot of young carers who they probably were not aware of were young carers. And of course, in all those cases where you're telling schools that there are young carers because you know who they are, or where schools use the MACA to identify young carers who are pupils, then those would be coded as S in the school census return, as in they've been discovered within the school setting. That's correct, isn't it, Andy?
Yeah.
So as you can see here, there's a number of questions: clean your own bedroom, clean other rooms, decorate rooms, take responsibility for shopping, work part-time to bring money in, interpret, sign or use another communication system, help the person you care for to dress or undress, help the person you care for to have a wash, help the person you care to have a bath or a shower, keep an eye on the person you care for to make sure they're all right, etc., etc. 18 statements. Next slide, please, Andy. So those 18 statements, if a child ticks the never box, you score it as 0. If they tick the box some of the time, you score it as 1. And if they tick a box a lot of the time, you score it as 2. It's really, really simple, really simple. And basically, you will find that the maximum score any child could have would be that for all 18 items, they might do all of those 18 items a lot of the time. So you would be scoring all of those items as 2, and that would be a score of 18 items a lot of the time is 36. If they don't do any caring tasks, i.e. never to all 18 items, then the overall score will be 0. They're not a young carer. Now, the average score that we have found for young carers projects, so you may well have done this already with your own young carers in your projects. The average score is around anything from 12 to about 14 or 15. It'd be really interesting if we had time for those of you who use the MACA to say what the average score is of your young carers in your project. But around 10, 14, 15, anything between 10 to 14, 15 seems to be the sort of scores that many young carers projects are having. Now, we know from comparing, from doing the statistical work, that a score of 0 is obviously no caring. A score of 1 to 9 is a low amount of caring activity. 10 to 13 would be moderate, and 14 to 17 would be high. If a child said that they did a lot of the time, all 18 items, and had a score of 36, that would be outrageous, frankly. It would be so worrying. And that would be a real good example of what Laura was talking about, would be inappropriate or excessive caring. If you want a sort of figure that I would equate with excessive, I would be saying any score from sort of 14, 15 onwards would be starting to feel very heavy, and a score of over 17 would be very heavy and very excessive. So I'm just trying to link that score with the concept of inappropriate or excessive caring. Next slide, please, Andy. Now, inappropriate rests to some extent, not just on a score, but the kinds of tasks that a young person is doing. And so the MACA gives you an overall score. You can have an overall score for a child, anything from 0 to 36, with the average being 14. But you can also break down the MACA into what we call 6 subscales. So there are 18 questions, and for those 18 questions, believe it or not, 3 questions relate to each of 6 subscales. So 3 questions in the MACA relate to domestic activities, household, and then 3 questions relate to household management, 3 questions relate to financial and practical management, 3 relate to personal care, 3 relate to emotional care and supervision, and 3 relate to sibling care. And so in this little chart, it tells you which of those 18 questions relate to each of these subscales. And for each of these, you can create a score for the subscales. So you could see, for example, that a child with a score, let's say on the MACA, their score is 14. You would be able to then see, actually, that's their overall score, but they score really heavily on intimate and personal care, but they don't seem to be doing much domestic activity. Or another child might have a score of 12 overall, but they're doing a lot of emotional support and a lot of sibling care, but very little household management. So the subscales allow you to interrogate and break down the overall scale for a child to identify what they're doing a lot of and what they're doing less of. So you have the benefit of an overall score which shows whether they're doing an excessive amount of care, an average amount of care, or whatever, or no care at all, and then the subscales which allow you to determine whether a child is providing a heavy amount of particular types of care. And you would then be able to ask them questions using the MACA as your baseline. What's it like? What do you feel about providing so much personal or intimate care? What's your experience of providing the financial and practical management of the house? Those kind of things. So effectively, that's what the MACA is. As I say, the Children's Commissioner for England has asked that it be used in all schools going forward. It obviously links now with the whole issue of census. These are two, the Children's Commissioner and the school census, are sort of separate moments that are now coming together. And I hope very much that you will find the MACA useful for you to identify young carers in schools or in any setting, getting scores for the young carers in your own projects, and also to encourage schools to use the MACA so that they will know about more young carers when they have to tick the box for S in the school census return. The MACA will help them identify far more young carers than they probably are aware of at this moment. You can find the MACA document by that link. It's a guidance document, tells you how to score it. It gives you the MACA's on one page. It's really easy. You just photocopy the page, you give it to kids to fill in whatever setting, or the school gives it to the kids to fill in. And the scoring mechanism and the instructions are all in the manual. I have to thank Carers Trust for providing the resources to develop the MACA and the PANOC, the positive and negative outcomes of caring instrument, which measures the impact of caring on children. It's the sister psychometric instrument. We developed this 10 years ago, funded by Carers Trust. And as I say, it's now used widely in the sector and internationally. Thanks very much for the opportunity to tell you about it today. Back to you, Andy.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Saul. Kath, I can see you've got your hand up. If it's okay, we're going to leave questions and comments to the end, just we're really keen to make sure we get through all the content for the session today. It is worth sort of really stressing that what's been said in the chat, that in terms of the MACA is a really helpful tool, but absolutely should be done almost as a really planned approach by the school as to how they're going to identify their young carers. And again, later on at the end of the session, I'll be sharing about a resource that's been produced by members of the Young Carers Alliance, which has a whole variety of things for schools to consider, a bit of a checklist to work through from that perspective as well. Because actually, if you do it without any awareness, you'll get a very different result to if you actually do awareness raising around who young carers are, and to get comms out to parents around what you're doing from that perspective as well. So, but as has also come up in the chat, there are some groups of young carers where they possibly won't ever score as highly on the MACA from that perspective, either because they're doing a lot of emotional support and not as much of the rest of the side. Obviously, the subscaling questions can help with that. but also because there can be other issues as well. So it's really important to be looking at how do we raise awareness of these particular groups and be looking out for these groups of children and young people within schools as well. So I'm going to hand over, without further ado, to Claire Casser, who's the Chief Executive at SIBS, to talk about actually in terms of those siblings who are providing support to a brother or sister. Thanks very much, Claire.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Andy. Good morning, everyone. Yep, my name is Claire Casser. I'm the Chief Executive here at SIBS. We're the UK charity dedicated to supporting the brothers and sisters of disabled children and adults. Next slide, please, Andy. So the sibling journey starts in childhood, and there are some key themes that we see for siblings. They tend to have less attention from parents, and this is something that we work with parents about, but it's also something that siblings tell us is key for them in their childhood, that they take less priority in their families. They tend to have more worries and responsibilities than their peers. We hear about siblings who experience prejudice in their communities. And many siblings, of course, are young carers, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And of course, that can change throughout their childhood. So they may become young carers later in childhood. We've heard of many young siblings become young carers throughout the pandemic when support services were limited. Siblings struggle with sleep, with friendships and schoolwork. Sleep is something that we're really keen to talk about at SIBS because it's something that's rarely talked about in the field of parent carers, for example. It's never talked about in relation to siblings. They may be sharing bedrooms, they may not be able to have friends over for sleepovers. So it has a massive impact on their social life, but also on their school attainment. Some siblings will have experienced challenging behaviour, so be caring for a brother or sister who has behaviour which challenges, and that's probably one of the biggest queries we hear from young siblings about who contact the charity directly. And the last point, maybe overachievers, passive, very passive or act out. What we tend to see in siblings, particularly in the school setting, is that they try really hard. These are the really good children, they get on with it, they're resilient, they have to be mature, and quite often in talking to teachers, they often say, oh yeah, those are the children we tend to sit by another disabled child in the class. It tend to be the children who are looking after and taking on more care responsibilities within the school setting. Next slide, please, Andy. So siblings as young carers often, as has been said already, are hidden young carers. Their needs are often overlooked. I think there's a real reluctance for parents often to tell school that their child is a sibling child. And that's because they want the school setting to be the place where they're not someone's brother or sister, that they can be a child or young person in their own right. Siblings are often caring for multiple family members. So not only are they supporting a brother or sister, but often also supporting a parent to care too. And siblings are very good at identifying when a parent has had a really tough day, filling in when care and support services aren't available. I think sibling carers are more likely to be supporting a brother or sister with behaviour which challenges, and we've heard of some terrifying situations of young siblings, very young siblings, caring for 14, 15-year-old brothers or sisters with quite challenging and difficult behaviours. More likely than other groups of young carers to be caring for someone with a learning disability or autism. Something we're still hearing about a lot is about siblings providing care in school time. So being taken out of a classroom to calm down a brother or sister when teachers are not being successful with that. And also unidentified caring. So recent example of a boy who was checking his brother was clean in the toilets at lunchtime because he was concerned that there would be that peer pressure of his brother not being hygienic and the pressure that might face for him. So, but actually school weren't aware, and mum became aware, and actually, things then came into place. But I think that unidentified caring is quite common. It's also lifelong caring. that sibling relationship is the longest relationship we have with anyone. So not only are siblings concerned about care responsibilities now, but also in the future. Who will look after my brother or sister in the future? And it's important to say that SIBS as a charity supports siblings across the lifespan. Next slide, please. And I know we're tight on time. I just thought this is such a great slide. It was some sibling young carers who all had an autistic brother or sister, and some of their concerns. So the pressures on social time, expectations of school teachers not really getting it if they'd been up all night and then weren't paying attention in class, and that pressure from parents, particularly for siblings who don't have a disability, who are expected to achieve and do really, really well, but often with very little support. Next slide, please, Andy. And thank you for listening. You can contact us at SIBS directly. We're on social media. We also have a dedicated section of our website for young siblings called Young SIBS. I'll leave it there, Andy. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Claire. And I think it's so important to be looking at this group, because I think, again, it's one where systems come into play, that actually in terms of if you've got somewhat, if you're looking at in terms of potentially who's got an educational healthcare plan within your school, do they have any siblings from that perspective? Again, we've talked a lot about in terms of comms and how important it is. If you say, are they a young carer, let us know, you'll get a very small response from that sense. Whereas if you include some of these examples, saying actually, do they have a brother or sister who's got a condition or is disabled, from that perspective, gives a very, very different in terms of response rate from that sense. So it all comes into the comms from that perspective. And similarly, another group where often they can be very sort of underrepresented, and there can be sort of concerns about sort of self-identification, is where it's a young carer supporting someone because of substance misuse as well. So I'm really pleased that we've got Tracy Page on the call from Children's Society, who does a lot of work specifically around this group of young carers. So she's just going to talk for a few minutes about her experience of this group and the need to support them as well. So I'll hand over to Tracy.
Lovely. Morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. I was just going to tell you really a little bit about the project that I work for. So ours is a community hidden harm awareness team. It's known as CHAT, and it works with children and young people that are aged between 8 to 19 years across Essex, are affected by parents or carers' familial substance misuse, addiction and mental health issues. That includes alcohol, illegal drugs and legal drug misuse. We define hidden harm as abuse that often goes unnoticed and it takes place behind closed doors. CHAT supports young people with the challenges they're faced with, such as domestic abuse issues, which increased during the pandemic due to lockdown and additional family stress relating to the poverty, financial wellbeing and physical and emotional health. The detrimental impact of hidden harm on mental health means young people experience depression, anxiety, low self-confidence and may be at risk of self-harm. Young people affected by hidden harm are often private about what is happening in their home, meaning that they are very reluctant to access support and afraid of the stigma around substance misuse and mental health, unfortunately. This can lead to young people feeling more isolated and alone. CHAT provides a one-to-one trauma-informed interventions, targeted group work, peer support and kinship care groups, which help young people to open up about their concerns in a safe, trusting environment. To ensure young people are safely referred to the service, we work with with local partners such as social services, schools, the police, local authorities, GP surgeries and young carer groups to raise awareness of the programme and the support that it can offer. We do remain extremely concerned, though, as the growing rates of children and young people living with a parent who has a substance addiction and or a mental health issue. Research has shockingly found that 700,000 children aged between the ages of 10 and 17 are estimated to be living with one or two alcohol-dependent parents in the UK. 2.6 million children live with parents who drink to hazardous levels, and 1 in 3 children aged 10 to 17 experience negative consequences as a result of their parents drinking. From experience, we know the effects of young people living with a substance misusing parent or family member, or a parent with mental health issues, can have a significant and lasting impact on that young person's own mental health and well-being, potentially leading to a poor educational attainment, antisocial behaviour, substance misuse, teenage pregnancy and criminal activity, to name but a few. Since lockdown, we have learned through direct feedback from young people that they felt less able to talk about their feelings during lockdown due to the increased inability to leave the home easily to allow for a safe space to talk openly. The impact of COVID-19 lockdowns has meant young people are dealing with heightened emotional and wellbeing issues. So a little bit about how chat supports these young people. Starting with self-care, many young people don't tell anyone what's going on at home because they're scared or worried it'll get their parents into trouble. So they sort of keep it a secret at the cost of their own mental health. Through working in one-to-one or in groups, chat gets young people thinking about themselves. We talk, we listen, we share self-care techniques so they can take charge of their own well-being and get into positive routines. Many told us that they felt more confident and positive about future goals. Their self-esteem, engagement at school and ability to open up to people all improved. Consistent and reliable support from a trusted adult. Chat go above and beyond to ensure young people stay engaged. For example, sending out electronic devices that have been donated to ensure young people could continue speaking with their practitioners during the lockdown. Giving them safe spaces for sharing. Children living with addicted parents often find it hard to talk, so we offer safe spaces for children affected by substance misuse and mental health to come together and talk about their feelings. It shows them that they're not alone and there are other children going through the same thing, and many keep in touch even after they leave the project. Breaking that cycle of blame and understanding about addiction and rethinking the blame. There are children across this country who blame themselves for their parents' drinking and drug abuse. Some start giving up on themselves. We work to change that outlook. We help them understand addiction and realise that it's not their fault. Chat empowers these young people to open up about things at home and focus more on themselves. Safety planning as well to decrease the risk, supporting young people who are on children in need, child protection plans, working with other professionals for safety planning and engaging in multi-agency meetings to ensure the need and risk is not missed. And then working with families and professionals, as well as working obviously directly with the young people. We also support families and professionals. We raise awareness so more people can spot the signs a child is being neglected. We promote best practice so young people feel able to build strong relationships with their worker and feel confident as well to ask for that help. And then we have peer support. Hearing from those who have experienced similar things contributes to young people's feelings and feel less isolated and alone. This has an impact on wider issues such as being less vulnerable to grooming and exploitation. During lockdown, the team held group sessions online as isolation was a big concern. Chat engaged with 87 young people between the 1st of April 2021 and the 31st of March 2022, delivering group and one-to-one sessions. The majority of our referrals received are via social care teams, with the second most common route being via educational professionals. And that is it. Thank you for listening to me.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Tracy. It's so helpful to get an overview of actually the sort of support that can be provided to this particular group of young people. I think they are a group who often sort of do miss out on support. And I think Debbie's put a really useful sort of comment in the chat about sort of potential barriers to being able to access that support. So it'd be great if you could answer in the chat or later on just about how your service helps with that. So the final group we're going to sort of cover about from that perspective, and it's worth saying, appreciate we are slightly behind on time, but in terms of there is going to be sort of chance later on to, if people can't stay past 11:30, to put questions in the chat that they want answering, and we'll make sure that the speakers and the panelists sort of provide answers that we can send out with the slides as well from that sense. But in terms of other groups, I'm just going to finish by talking about those children who are supporting parents with a mental illness. So as I mentioned, I also work for the charity Our Time, who are the charity for children of parents with a mental illness. And in terms of the scale, actually we're looking at 1 in 3 children and young people is living with a parent with depression or anxiety. But we're looking at 1 in 10 who are living with someone with a severe mental illness. So in terms of a scale, that means you're looking at potentially 3 children in every single class, in every single school across the country has got a parent or an adult, they're living with a severe mental illness. And this can have a significant impact on them. In terms of what we've seen in research is that actually when you're living with a parent with mental illness, actually you're 3 times more likely to develop mental health problems themselves. Similarly to what we just heard from Tracy and also from Claire, is that often they're not identified until they get to a crisis or safeguarding point from that perspective, because they don't see themselves as young carers. And if you said to their parent, oh, is your child a young carer? There'll be a significant number who say, no, they don't care for me. No, they're not a carer from that sense. And so it all comes back to that dialogue around language, which I'll touch upon in a second. And they're often missed because so much of their support is emotional, or the impact it's having on them from that perspective. So I'll give you a very brief sort of example of a young person who I sort of spoke to, where actually his mum was first sectioned when he was 4 years old. So throughout all his time growing up, he saw mum going in and out of hospital. He was visiting mum in hospital, often for significant periods of time. There were times where his mum was in hospital for over half of the year from that perspective. And school were aware, and they were making sure that in terms of from a safeguarding perspective, that everything was fine there. But it was only when he was 14 when actually he started to have issues with bullying, because people started making your mum jokes, making comments, calling her crazy, things like that, that actually he just couldn't take it anymore. And it only at that point, 10 years after he first had a parent with a mental illness from that sense, did anyone ask him about, did he need any support from that sense as well? And when I spoke to him, he said actually, because he also had a dad with a physical disability as well, which meant that when mum was in hospital, he was having to provide more support for his dad from that sense. And he said, actually, I don't mind the physical side. That's not the hardest bit. The hardest bit is when mum barricades herself in her room and I have to be on the other side of the bedroom trying to get her out. Or actually when the police have come because they've got to try and find mum or they're worried about her. Because for him, when he was growing up, he was really worried that actually when the police were involved, it's because his mum had done something wrong, rather than actually they were trying to make sure that mum was safe from that perspective. And you can see here in terms of some NSPCC research a few years ago highlighted actually just the sort of common denominator where parental mental health difficulties were a factor in serious case reviews. So how do we improve identification of this group? As I mentioned, language is key. If you only ask pupils about a disability, then this whole cohort of young people will always be missed. So specifically mentioning mental illness as something, as one of the groups of young people you're looking to identify and making sure supported is really important, but so is raising awareness of mental health more generally, in terms of actually if mental health is a subject that people don't talk about in schools, that pupils don't talk about, then often there's that fear and that stigma around talking out and saying, actually, yeah, my mum has a mental illness, my dad has a mental illness from that perspective as well. And it's worth saying that at our time, we do specific work with schools. So we work with schools across the country, offering sort of PSHE sessions. We've done staff training. We've got resources to try and help promote that conversation of mental health and that link to sort of parental mental illness as well from that sense. And it's so important to say why you're asking about the young carers. We saw in the chat earlier about the use of the MACA. If you just get pupils to complete the MACA without any sort of comms, you'll get quite a few parents who might be quite concerned, saying, hang on, why are you asking my child all of this? Whereas actually, if you say there's so much support available, we want to make sure that if they do need support, if they need someone to talk to, that's available. You'll get a much more positive response from that sense as well. And it's also keeping in your mind that it's not just the physical side of their caring role. As I mentioned earlier with that example, the emotional side can often be the one they find most difficult from that perspective, and particularly because it can fluctuate. Sometimes these young carers can get almost lulled into a full sense of security. Oh, actually, mum's better now. Whereas actually what happens is mum might be stable and her mental health might be stable for a period of weeks, period of months, sometimes even years, and then very, very quickly straight to crisis point. If you don't know that that young person's a young carer, then actually you're going to be chasing your tail trying to get everything in place in terms of support. If you're a school and you've identified them as a young carer, even though they don't need any support at this moment in time because mum's doing really well, at least then they know where support is available, what help is there should they need it as well. And as I mentioned with that example I shared, for some of these young people, they are juggling in terms of supporting someone with both a mental illness as well as a physical illness and disability as well. So that was just a really brief overview. As I mentioned, Our Time's got a range of support available for schools. I've got one of my colleagues, Beth, on the call today. So if you wanted to find out more about what Our Time does around this particular group of children and young people, our contact details are on there. So is our website and our social media as well. So do feel free to get in touch as well. So we're just going to finish now by looking at actually the difference that having some of these systems in place can make. We've talked a lot about in terms of different groups, we talked about processes, but actually having an example in practice of how this has worked for a young carer service and a school as well. So I'm really delighted to have Laura Cole here from My Time Young Carers, and also Samantha Viney, who's a principal at Glenmore and Winton Academies. I was asked to go and speak at My Time's conference earlier in the year, and I heard Sam talking. I sat in on her workshop, and I knew I wanted to get her at this session because their experience of what they've done is a really, really insightful experience of actually how this can work if we get it right as well. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Laura.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Laura Cole. I'm from My Time Young Carers, and we are a young carer charity based in Dorset. So you could go to the next slide, please, Andy. Oh, and the next one. So I work on our school support programme, which we've named Level Up. We did name it before the government, so just putting it out there. We currently work with over 70 schools and colleges in Dorset, and we work with these schools to change the culture and raise awareness about young carers and young adult carers. So just to give you a brief summary of what we offer on this programme, which is currently free to all schools and colleges in Dorset. We create a policy with the school, and it's very much personalised to the school and their values and aims, and it's all about how the school is going to support young carers. And from this policy, it then stems that we deliver staff CPD. And this isn't just to teachers or just to pastoral staff. We believe it's really important that every single member of staff in the school receives the staff CPD. As we've heard, it's about changing the whole school culture and having every member of staff able to identify and raise awareness about young carers. We also recommend that every school we work with has a young carer champion. And again, this is so every young carer knows that we've got that one person they can go and talk to when they have an issue. And at My Time, we support that young carer champion with regular meetings and providing any support that they need. Often we have a lot of schools who are part of a multi-academy trust, and we think it's really important to get those young carer champions together. And it's all about sharing good practice. And it's also knowing that you're not the only one maybe struggling with something as well. I always found that really helpful when I was a teacher. And so it's nice to be able to come up with solutions together. But we don't just work with school staff. We also work a lot with all of the students in the schools as well. Again, to raise awareness of young carers through assemblies and PSHE lessons. But we've also found these are a really great place for children to self-identify as well. Maybe they didn't realise what they were doing was an excessive amount of caring, or even if they were caring at all, they just thought it was normal, especially if they're in primary school. So it's really important that every child is aware of who young carers are, and again, given that opportunity to self-identify. As well as that, we often go into the young carers groups in schools and work with the young carers there, and we also take them out on our Making Memories days. Recently, in the summer term, we actually brought primary schools and their feeder secondary schools together, and we mixed the year 6 young carers with the year 7s and 8s. So again, when they go and start the new school in September, they would have recognisable faces, and they'd also know who that young carer champion is straight away. And as Andy mentioned, we had our education summit in June held at Bournemouth University, and we had over 100 education and health and social care professionals attend. And it was a really important day where we shared a lot of information about young carers and why it's so important that schools are at the forefront of changing our awareness of young carers. Next slide, please, Andy. So to go into a little bit more detail about our policy, it's, again, like I said, it's very personalised to the school. We make sure it's different for every school. But in that policy, we always encourage that the young carer champion has an SLT link and a line manager, but also that there's a governor link as well. Again, it's having that whole school ethos rather than just a select few people being aware. We also think it's really important that every young carer is identified on the management information system. So for example, SIMS. It's really important, again, that these children are recognised just like Pupil Premium and SEN children are recognised in the classroom as well. And it could be as simple as knowing where a child likes to sit in the classroom. We know one young carer whose mum has got quite severe arthritis, and when it rains, he gets really worried because he knows it's going to make arthritis worse. So actually, he doesn't like to be sat next to the window. But just having that information that he's a young carer on the system can make a huge impact to that child's learning. So it doesn't even have to have a huge, you've got to make a huge change. Just, knowing maybe where to sit children as well is really important. The main point of the policy is it's all about, the aim is to improve the progress and raise the standard of achievement for young carers. And if you could go on to the next slide, Andy, please. We've got some great examples from the schools that we work with. So for example, the Blandford School, their young carer champion has monthly meetings with his SLT lead, where they discuss the attainment of young carers in the school. And they're meeting that policy every month, meeting the aims of that policy every month. Having that meeting, they were able to identify that one of their young carers was really struggling in maths. And with the support of my time, we've been able to get that young carer free maths tutoring. And again, it's just making sure that you're identifying these children and maybe where they're struggling to get the support that they need in education. But also, if there's a crisis going on at home, making sure that that child has got the flexibility they need from school as well. Ambitions Academies Trust include young carers in the groups that they monitor in their progress meetings. So as well as People Premium and SEN, they are talking about young carers as well. And again, it's making sure that they are an identified, recognisable group that are constantly tracked across schools. And as I've already mentioned, we do have multi-academy trust meetings as well. We often start the meetings by asking young carer champions, how is your school meeting the policy aims? 1, not very good, 5, very good. And again, it's sharing good practice. If one school is struggling to meet a certain aim, getting another school to share good practice is really useful as well. And one of the best schools that we've worked with is Glenmore and Winton Academies. They're one of the first schools that started on our Level Up programme, and we're so impressed with all of the work that we've done. So I'll lead you on to Sam Viney now.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you very much, everybody. Really delighted to be invited to speak with everyone today. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background about who we are. My name's Sam Viney, and I am the principal of 2 large secondary schools in Bournemouth called Glenmore and Winton. So we are a girls' school and a boys' school, but we're co-located. We have roughly 2,000 pupils on roll and around 220 members of staff, so we're quite a big establishment. Since we've been working alongside my time in the past 2.5, 3 years, we've seen a massive shift in our culture at the academies, which I'm going to talk about in later slides, but also more positively is that we've seen a massive shift in the number of identified young carers, and there's still lots that we can do to improve on that. So I'm really excited to talk to you about where we started, where we currently are, and then what our hopes are to progress this even further and continue to evolve. Next slide, please, Andy. So it was really important for me when I took over the headship. My previous position was raising standards of disadvantaged pupils, predominantly those identified as PP and SEND. And it always struck me that we didn't really talk about young carers. So from very early stages, we did, and we discussed them as we would do with any student that was pupil premium, SEND, a looked after child, young carer. So we started this process a number of years ago, and the beginnings, the starting point for us was around a whole school shift in culture, namely educating members of staff and the school community around what it meant to be a young carer and why this was so pivotal, vital, and why it should be a priority for the academies. It was also making sure that people understood that just because you are identified as a young carer, as with pupil premium or SEND, that this didn't mean about lowering expectations. It was not about treating them as a vulnerable, underachieving group. It was about education, identification, and being proactive. And also it's about educating staff that this wasn't a tokenistic effort just to tick a box to say that, yes, we talk about young carers and we advertise young carers. It was actually being able to step forward and say, what's the impact that we have on the lives of young carers? And making sure that people understood this isn't just about running an extracurricular club for students to have fun once per week. It should be embedded and it should infiltrate all sectors of the school community and levels of leadership at the academies as well and further. Next slide, please, Andy. Thank you. So we we wanted to ensure that the person that we had as identified as our young carer champion was a really important starting point. This had to be someone who understood what the priorities were for the academies, but also someone that understood the gravity of this position and what this meant. It wasn't about just having an additional TLR. It shouldn't have been about having an additional tag-on role, because this is where we often see roles being quite ineffective. We wanted the person to be very passionate about this, to be the main driver around raising the profile for young carers. And the best way the most effective way we found was to advertise this as a project-based role and ask people that were coming for interview to have a form of development plan. Over the last 2 years, this has been fantastic for us, because now we have people who are actively seeking professional development to become the Young Carers Champion. We didn't have this 2 years ago, so this is fantastic. So we now have succession planning in place where people have seen this role, the impact that this role can have, and now are shaping their career with us around hopefully one day being able to step into this role. We've progressed from having it as a project lead with just one person to now having 2 full-time young carer champions who do this as a dual role together, and it's now a paid position. We have an SLT link for young carers, and they have fortnightly line management with that SLT link. We also have a governor link, which I'll talk about in the next slides. Thank you, Andy. So I just wanted to chat to you really briefly around how we've raised the profile for young carers, but also how we've raised standards for young carers across all avenues. I've given you quite a few bits of information on the screen, and I'm just aware of time, so I will very briefly touch upon these areas. But I'm aware that if you've got any further questions, then please do just pop those in the chats and I can spend a little bit more time around that. I've already discussed around how identification was really important for us. We shifted from being in a position of reactive, i.e. once it hit crisis point that we were then having to step in and support a student identified as a young carer, to now being in a position where we're much more proactive. This has come from making sure that absolutely everybody that's in the building understands what being a young carer is, but also more importantly, those triggers and sometimes those warning flags that this might potentially be the case. This stemmed from whole school CPD and professional development around this, but more importantly, ongoing professional development. We launched it as with the support of my time actually around basically supporting everybody with their professional development, but now this happens on a half-termly basis as well. So young carers is never off the agenda. This might look like a best practice briefing, which is a 15-minute update on a Wednesday morning where the Young Carers Champion will deliver to all of the staff just an update on young carers. Or it may well be that we do an hour-long session after school around revisiting young carers. So this has been really important to us. We have a development plan solely for prioritising young carers. And this is what we call a development plan or a strategy plan. This links into the whole school plan, including our self-evaluation and the school improvement plan. It has to be something that's driven by all levels of leadership, and therefore it becomes a priority. Young carers, this one's a little bit difficult to kind of unpick in such a short period of time, but just to give you an overview. Young carers is, as I said before, is never off the agenda. So just to give you a diet of the last 5 days, last Wednesday, we have a best practice briefing and we were discussing seating plans. On there, young carers are identified. So part of the briefing was giving staff the opportunity to what we call speed date, so talk about students identified on their seating plans, what works, what doesn't, and link that into teaching and learning, adaptive teaching within the classroom. And next week we are, young carers are coming to the senior leadership team meeting of an evening to talk through their development plan and steps forward towards their strategy. And this isn't just about the last 5 days. This is an ongoing repeating pattern that you'll see throughout the academies. So we are frequently offer professional development. Young carers are frequently presenting in assemblies to students to not only raise awareness of young carers, but also to increase the confidence of our students who are identified as young carers. We've shifted from a position where students were reluctant to be identified, if that makes sense, or to ask for support, to now being, having young carers who are extremely proud of the fact that they are well supported, asking to run assembly. So next week or the week after, apologies, young carer team, as in the students, are running assemblies with every single year group, and that runs throughout the academic year as well. Next slide, please, Andy, thank you. I guess, obviously, it's very well in implementing different strategies. I think the key for us and the key for the success for us has very much been around what has the impact been of having a young carers champion, making sure that young carers is being discussed at teaching and learning meetings, at professional development meetings, at SLT, at governors meetings, because actually if there's zero impact, then really what's the point of what we're doing? We need to reevaluate. But I am delighted to say that over the last 18 months, 2 years, we have seen tangible differences and positive impacts on the lives of students in the increasing number of young carers that we're identifying. Again, we've unpicked this a little bit, that they can be a young carer for lots of different reasons, and it's very important that that's taken on a case-by-case basis. But what we have seen throughout the academies is an increase in attendance, for sometimes a very small shift in flexibility around supporting a child. We have seen an increased number of students being identified because of that professional development of everybody. We like to use the term that everybody is a champion of young carers, not just that one person who has the remuneration for the role. It is everybody. This has been massively successful, and I'll give you one prime example. The receptionist of the academies had a one standalone conversation with a young person who was late, and she just mentioned to him, "Oh, why are you late this morning?" Because he was past the late gate, if that makes sense, coming in about 9:20. "Oh, I just had to drop my brother off." That one small sentence, that receptionist knew to then email the mailbox at young carers. Just had this conversation with this young person. Notice he's not identified as a young carer on the system. Might be one to discuss. And lo and behold, what we uncovered was a young man who has to drop off siblings at the local primary school because mum works evening shifts, sleeps late into the morning. Now, technically, would we have picked that up previously? Probably not, because he's not someone that was coming onto our radar, but we were able to unpick that particular case and support the family and support the young person, and actually ended up uncovering quite a significant need of support with that family. That wouldn't have happened had that receptionist not been had the training and having such an open dialogue at the academies around young carers and how we can support them, such as one example. I guess something for me that's most important and something that I'm exceptionally proud of is that our young carers report back that they just feel exceptionally supported. They feel confident, they feel that they can step forward. They want to champion themselves to future generations of students that come through young carers, because they now feel that their voices are heard. They feel that they are being listened to, and they feel that they are able to continue the support and the amazing work that My Time have supported us with moving forward. I'm really aware that I've run over time, so I do apologise. But thank you very much for your time. If you do have any questions, then I would be more than welcome to extend on anything that I've discussed previously. But thank you very much.
No, thank you ever so much, Sam. Thank you ever so much, Laura. I think it's just such a prime example of how it can work well in practice, both in terms of the actual interventions, but then also the difference it's making for those young carers as well. So I was really, really keen to share this example. So thank you. So just before, in terms of, so as I said, the speakers have agreed beforehand that they're going to stay on for if there are any questions from that perspective, but I just want to sort of finish before we do open the floor for any questions from that sense, just to thank everyone so much for coming and giving up their time today, and also to let people know about some new resources that we're going to be publishing on the 26th. So members of the Young Carers Alliance have produced a sort of a comms pack specifically for schools around the school census, so containing some of the information that's contained in this webinar today, but also a series of sort of practical things that schools can be doing in preparation for the school census. So it's been put together by a variety of young carer organisations who are working with schools and have got lots of experience. You can see there's a young carers checklist so that you can work through, not saying now in the next few weeks, but throughout the year you can work through to make sure you've got that coordinated approach around actually how you identify your young carers from that sense as well. And there are also various examples of young carers policies and different models of support as well. So as I mentioned, we're not publicly publishing them yet. We are going to be waiting to the 26th to do that, but they are available on the Young Carers Alliance webpage now. So the link is there on the slides there. And as I said, hopefully that's of use for those of you who are young carers organisations. Do feel free to adapt and look at how you can use that in your local areas from that perspective. But hopefully that will help people in terms of to think about what they can do as well moving forward from that sense. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and just see, and to open the floor, see if there are any, if people want any questions, to put your hands up. But otherwise, all that's left for me to say is a huge thank you again for coming. If you go to the Young Carers Alliance, you can see our upcoming events. We've got a webinar next month on young carers and parental mental illness, which has currently got about 260 people signed up, proving really popular. But you can see a whole range of different things that we're doing there. But I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll hand over, and I'll see Angela's got a hand up, so I'll go to Angela first.
Hi, thanks everyone. Mine's not necessarily a question, it's more, I suppose, of observation / statement. And it's just one of the things I was mindful of. Sorry, I'm Angela, I'm a development worker in Liverpool and I do a lot of work going into schools. And I think bringing it back into the context of the school census, it's absolutely brilliant that we're at this place. My concern, if I'm honest, in this environment, is that if we don't use this as a good opportunity to join up what we've already got there. So I'm concerned around schools being really pushed and it being easy to put the no if they don't know that. And this is a massive opportunity, I think, for schools to be doing some work prior to that, to have a better understanding if they've got young carers, to have this as an opportunity to be identifying them. And I think the conversation about the Mackin and Panic, it's a fantastic tool, but it's also a big piece of work. And my worry is, are schools equipped to do that? So I think for me, what we finished on there is just fantastic in terms of good practice, showing that example of how if schools work in alignment with their local young carers service, get the support from them, the services are going in where that's able to. And if we're all working in partnership with this fantastic alliance here, we could be in a really good place. So I think any educational professionals on the call today, I would be really encouraging them to be linking in more with the alliances, with their young carers and local young carers services, to do that work that's needed before the census comes in, because I think we get the best out of that for all of our young carers across the board.
Completely agree. I'll bring Jackie in a second, but so that's exactly the approach we've taken. So in Norfolk and also Cambridgeshire is the young carers organisations there. So we're working with Centre 33 in Cambridgeshire and also young carers organisations in Norfolk to really do that piece of work, to link up with schools and to reassure them. I think schools have got a lot on their plate at the moment. I think still from the aftermath of the pandemic and continued impact, but I think in terms of what we didn't want is it to be seen as an extra piece of work for schools to be doing from that perspective. Rather, what we're looking to say is this is you're interested in supporting all of your pupils to attain and be happy and flourish in school. Let us help you to do that. And so again, so that's what we're proactively doing in Norfolk. So we're going out with other organisations to say, actually, here's the support available. So we've got different webinars throughout the term specifically aimed at schools around this and what they can do just to hold their hands through it, to be honest, for some of them from that perspective as well. But thank you for that, Angela, really great. I'll bring in Jackie.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Jackie Sanders. I'm from Team Manager at Surrey Young Carers. I just, yeah, this is absolutely brilliant. The same as what Angela was just saying. I just felt that there's one little link missing, and that's actually the local authority, because this is absolutely amazing. But actually, the most relevant part I found was about the local authorities being able to use this data, because unless we have the funding to be able to follow this up, actually it needs to be kind of embedded through the local authority, through the young carer strategy, and actually then to see that our service unfortunately had some cuts this year. So, you know, to carry on that work, I'd really like to see this forum include local authority and how they will pick up on this data and actually put it into the priorities locally, so that organisations like us can really do have the capacity to get into schools and link this together.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jackie. And I completely agree. They've got such a key role to play within this. So again, an example in Norfolk, that piece of work we're doing with schools is being done jointly between Join a Chat, Young Carers Matter Norfolk, ourselves, and the local authority. So it's being done, we're delivering the presentation to all of the head teachers in Norfolk, and that's being a joint presentation between the Young Carers Service and the local authority, so as well from that sense. I'll bring in Kath, and then I'll go to Jess.
I'm not sure my picture's working. Can people see me?
Yep.
Oh, brilliant. It's completely blank on my screen. It's just really to highlight and make people aware. This isn't a question because Andy, you touched on it very, very briefly about the siblings caring for someone who survived sexual abuse or sexual violence. Sometimes that can involve a parent being removed from the house very suddenly. Sometimes that abuse has happened outside the home or within the home. I would just encourage people to have a look at our website to actually see the kinds of impact. But if this is something that's happening within your school, or you're identifying the section 47 stuff that happens around this kind of allegation or disclosure, means that you will be identifying the primary victim. But schools need to be looking at, right, who else is this going to impact within our school community? Because very often there are siblings in the school, and we have heard horrendous stories of children being bullied, accused, tormented, all kinds of things, which has actually massively impacted their time in school. But their caring responsibilities outside of school may not necessarily be met by the MACA because of the level of trauma, the speed at which this kind of thing happens, and the lack of preparation or understanding and parental trauma as well. So please do have a look at our website. I'll put the link in the slide and my email address in the chat, and my email as well, if anyone would like to talk to supporting siblings of people who have survived sexual abuse or sexual violence.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Kath. It's really, really appreciated.
Really
I saw, I'm just saying, I saw Jess Searle. Jess, you had your hand up. Brilliant. Yeah, it's back up again. Oh, you're on mute, Jess. Oh, there we go. Oh, can't seem to hear you, Jess. It's not saying you're muted, but there's no sound coming through. Wash, if you want to try and see if you can figure out the sound. Saul, is it okay if I bring you in? There's just a couple of questions in the chat just around the MACA and whether there's any potential or sort of plans to update it, because it's a tool that's been around those statements for a fair while, to update to reflect potentially changing sort of dynamics of what young carers are doing. But that's what I'll bring you in for your thoughts on that.
Okay, so thanks, Andy. The MACA was designed about 10 years ago And it was a really radical breakthrough in those days, because we had no instruments to measure children's caring roles or the PANOC to measure the outcomes of caring. And a lot of these psychometric instruments go on for many years. I mean, it's still fine as a generic device to use with a wide range of young carers, just like many other instruments. So many of us will have gone into a hospital and will be given a questionnaire to fill in the waiting room with 6 questions, and then that will actually be a psychometric to determine whether we're prone to X, Y, and Z. So it's got longevity. It can still be used widely with a generic group. Where it's less, where it probably needs, and it needs to stay as it is. You can never mess with the MACA and you can't change the order of the questions either. I noticed in the chat someone said that they were using the MACA YC42, and the MACA YC42, which is in a much longer set of questions, is not a psychometric instrument, so you can't score it like the MACA YC18. So if you're going to do the kind of things we've been discussing today, you use the MACA YC18. And you can still carry on using it. In the future, we should develop some more specific psychometric instruments. So I think it would be helpful to develop another scale, which would be to measure the caring roles of children looking after parents with mental health problems, in which I include under mental health, drug, alcohol misuse, addiction, etc. Because I think that the MACA picks out those kids because of the emotional support questions and a few other questions. But I think that it would be good to develop some more specific instruments going forward. You just need to know that the work that goes into developing a psychometric instrument can take a couple of years. Because you have to, there's a particular way of developing these. This is the bread and butter of many psychologists and academic psychologists in terms of, so you're talking about creating item pools of hundreds of items so that you can come down to 18 or 20 items, which represent all of the other items. So it's a massive piece of work to develop specific ones. So my final comment on this is the MACA and the PANOC are still absolutely fine to use. They will still do the business that's written on the side of the tin. They will carry on being used for many, many years. And in due course, I and hopefully all other academics and other people will develop specific instruments to use with specific groups.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Saul. And I think I'm very conscious of people's time, and some people may have 12 o'clock meetings or wanting to get to their lunch break soon. So I'll finish that there. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to everyone who's attended today. Hopefully it's been of use for you in the work that you're doing. If you do have any questions, please do get in touch. As has been mentioned throughout the call, Young Carers Alliance is a network. It's a network now of over 115 organisations, including schools. We've got local authorities, young carers organisations, national organisations, universities, but also individuals. So if you're keen to find out more about the latest information about young carers, or how you can support or be able to share best practice or get advice or support from others working with young carers, do feel free to go to the Young Carers Alliance website. I'll put the link in the chat. I do a weekly bulletin. And so that again has opportunities for young carers, opportunities to get involved. So please do get in touch. And again, thank you once again for giving up your time and coming along this morning. I'll speak to people soon.